I stood in my backyard, staring at what looked like a construction site where my peaceful woodland used to be. My coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips as a bulldozer tore through century-old oak trees. The sound of chainsaws and heavy machinery had woken me at 7 in the morning on what should have been a quiet Saturday in my home just outside Asheville, North Carolina. I owned 15 acres of mixed forest and meadow, and the back 7 acres were supposed to be untouched woodland that I'd preserved since buying the property 5 years ago. What the hell is going on? I shouted over the noise, jogging toward the construction crew in my pajama pants and bare feet. A man in a hard hat turned around, clipboard in hand. "Private property, sir. You need to step back." "This is my private property," I said, my heart hammering. "I'm Franklin Baxter. I own this land." The man looked confused and flipped through papers on his clipboard. "According to our permits, this is HOA land. We're building storage units for the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association." I lived in Meadowbrook Heights, a development of about 60 homes that had been built around my grandfather's old property. When the developer approached me years ago, I'd sold them 20 acres but kept 35 for myself, including the house my grandfather built in 1972. The HOA managed the common areas in the development, like the pool and the small park near the entrance, but they had absolutely no claim to my woodland. "Stop everything right now," I demanded. "You're making a mistake. I never gave permission for this." The foreman, whose name tag read Miguel, looked genuinely worried now. "Look, man, I just go where they tell me. We got all the permits from the county and everything. The HOA hired us 3 months ago. 3 months ago." My voice cracked. "I never heard anything about this." Miguel pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, we got a situation here. The property owner is saying this is his land." He paused, listening. "Okay, she's coming." 20 minutes later, a white Mercedes SUV pulled up to the construction site, and out stepped exactly who I expected. Patricia Winters, the president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. She was in her mid-50s with that haircut that somehow all HOA presidents seem to have, blonde with aggressive highlights, and she carried herself like she owned the entire world. "Mr. Baxter," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm sorry for the confusion, but this construction is completely legitimate." "Legitimate? You're destroying my property." Patricia pulled a folder from her designer bag and handed me a document. "As you can see, the HOA has an easement on this land dating back to 1985. When your grandfather was alive, he granted the original developer an easement for community use. That easement transferred to the HOA when the development was completed." I scanned the document, my hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. It did look official, with legal language about access rights and community benefits. But something felt wrong about this. My grandfather had been sharp as a tack until the day he died, and he'd always told me the property line was clear and absolute. "Even if there was an easement, that doesn't give you the right to build commercial storage units," I said. "Community storage units," Patricia corrected, her smile never wavering. "For the benefit of all residents." And yes, the easement specifically allows for structures that benefit the community. "We're well within our rights, Mr. Baxter. I suggest you consult the HOA bylaws, which you agreed to when you purchased your home." "I bought my home before the HOA existed," I shot back. "My grandfather built this house 50 years ago. But you're still part of the development now and you pay HOA fees. That means you agreed to the bylaws." She turned to Miguel. "Please continue with the work." "Mr. Baxter, if you interfere with this construction, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action against you." I stood there speechless, as she climbed back into her Mercedes and drove away. The construction crew looked at me with sympathy but started their machinery back up. I walked back to my house feeling like I'd just been hit by a truck. Inside, I immediately started searching through the boxes of documents my grandfather had left me. There had to be something in here that proved this was wrong. I found the original property deed, survey maps from 1972, and correspondence with the developer from 2018 when I'd sold the 20 acres. Nothing mentioned an easement. By noon, I'd called every lawyer in Asheville. Most were closed on Saturday, but I left desperate voicemails. One attorney, Sandra Kim, called me back within an hour. "Mr. Baxter, I can't give you legal advice until we have a formal consultation, but I can see you Monday morning at 9, she said. "In the meantime, document everything. Take photos, videos, and don't sign anything the HOA gives you." I spent the rest of the weekend taking pictures and videos of the destruction. By Sunday evening, they'd cleared 2 acres of woodland and were preparing to pour concrete foundations. Every tree that fell felt like a punch to the gut. Those woods had been my sanctuary, the place I went to think and decompress after long days at my job as a software engineer. I'd seen deer, foxes, and even a black bear back there. Now it looked like a war zone. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. I was at Sandra Kim's office 15 minutes early, carrying a briefcase full of documents. Her office was in a renovated Victorian house downtown, and she met me with a firm handshake and intelligent eyes that immediately put me at ease. "Tell me everything," she said, settling behind her desk with a legal pad. I laid out the whole story, showing her the document Patricia had given me and all my grandfather's papers. Sandra examined everything carefully, making notes and occasionally pulling up information on her computer. "This easement document troubles me," she finally said. "The language is legitimate, but something feels off about the dates. It says 1985, but your grandfather didn't have any dealings with developers until the late 2010s, correct?" "Right. The development didn't even start until 2016. The land around here was all farmland and forest back in the 80s. Sandra nodded slowly. "I need to do a title search and pull records from the county. Easements have to be properly recorded to be valid. If this exists, it should be in the public record. But Mr. Baxter, I have to be honest with you. If this easement is legitimate, you're in a difficult position. Easements can be very hard to challenge. But even if it exists, can they really build storage units?" I asked. "That depends on the specific language of the easement. Some easements are very broad, others are narrow. We need to see the original recorded document, not just this copy the HOA president gave you." She leaned forward. "I'm going to be straight with you. This will likely be expensive and time-consuming. HOAs have legal funds and they don't back down easily. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about those woods, about my grandfather's legacy, about the principle of the thing. "Yes, I'm prepared." Sandra took my case and got to work immediately. She filed a temporary restraining order that afternoon, arguing that irreparable harm was being done to my property while the legitimacy of the easement was in question. We had a hearing scheduled for Wednesday morning. Tuesday, I took the day off work and went to the county recorder's office myself. The clerk, a patient woman named Janet, helped me search through property records going back to 1970. We found my grandfather's original purchase, every property tax payment, and the 2018 sale of the 20 acres. But there was no easement recorded in 1985 or any other year. "That's odd," Janet said, adjusting her reading glasses. "If there was an easement granted, it should definitely be here. Easements are interests in real property, and they have to be recorded to be valid against future owners." So if it's not recorded, it's not valid. I felt a surge of hope. Well, that's a legal question for a lawyer, Janet said carefully. But generally speaking, unrecorded easements can be problematic. Let me check one more thing. She typed on her computer for several minutes. There's nothing. No easement on your property at all in our records. I got copies of everything and rushed to Sandra's office. She was preparing for the hearing and looked up with interest when I arrived. There's no recorded easement, I said breathlessly, dumping the copies on her desk. The county has no record of it. Sandra's eyes lit up. Now that's interesting. That's very interesting indeed. She examined the documents carefully. This changes things significantly. The HOA can't enforce an easement that was never properly recorded. The question now is whether they fabricated this document or whether they're simply mistaken. Wednesday morning, we arrived at the Buncombe County Courthouse early. Patricia Winters was already there with the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Douglas Hartman. He had that confidence that comes from winning too many cases against intimidated homeowners. Judge Ellen Morrison presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness. Sandra presented our request for a temporary restraining order, explaining the situation concisely and professionally. Your Honor, my client owns this property in fee simple with clear title. The HOA has produced a document claiming an easement, but our search of the county records shows no such easement was ever recorded. They're destroying 2 acres of woodland based on a document that may not even be legitimate. We're asking the court to halt construction until this matter can be properly adjudicated. Douglas Hartman stood up, still confident. Your Honor, the HOA has acted in good faith based on documents provided during the development process. The easement may have been overlooked during recording, but that doesn't make it invalid. We have the original signed document from 1985. You have that original document with you? Judge Morrison asked. Hartman hesitated. We have a certified copy, Your Honor. The original is in our files. I'd like to see it. The judge held out her hand. Hartman approached and handed over the document. Judge Morrison examined it carefully, and I watched her eyebrows rise slightly. She looked at Sandra. Counselor, approach please. Sandra went to the bench, and the judge showed her something on the document, speaking too quietly for me to hear. Sandra's back straightened, and when she returned to our table, she was trying to suppress a smile. Mr. Hartman, Judge Morrison said, this certified copy is dated June 2024. It was supposedly certified last month, but the document itself claims to be from 1985. Yes, Your Honor, it's a certification of the original 1985 document. Except the notary seal on this certification is from Nancy Green, who, according to the state database, only became a notary in 2022. And the document was supposedly signed by Walter Baxter in 1985, but I noticed the signature line shows he was president of the Meadowbrook Heights development. Mr. Hartman, when exactly was Meadowbrook Heights established? Hartman's confidence finally cracked. I would need to verify that, Your Honor. Sandra stood. Your Honor, Meadowbrook Heights development began in 2016. It was completed in 2018. There was no Meadowbrook Heights in 1985 because the land was still owned by Walter Baxter as undeveloped forest and farmland. The courtroom went silent. Judge Morrison looked at Patricia Winters, who had gone pale. Mrs. Winters, do you have any explanation for this? Patricia stood up, flustered. Your Honor, This document was given to me by the previous HOA board president. I assumed it was legitimate. We had no reason to think. You had no reason to verify a document before destroying someone's property. Judge Morrison's voice was sharp. This court is granting the temporary restraining order. All construction stops immediately. Furthermore, I'm ordering both parties to appear for a full hearing in 2 weeks. And Mrs. Winters, I strongly suggest your HOA board consult with legal counsel about the implications of using potentially fraudulent documents to justify construction on private property. We left the courthouse in a daze. Sandra was practically vibrating with energy. Frank, I think we've got them. That document is clearly fake. The question now is who created it and why. But more importantly, we can prove you have clear title to that land. Over the next 2 weeks, Sandra worked like a woman possessed. She subpoenaed HOA records, conducted depositions, and pieced together what had happened. The story that emerged was somehow both stupid and audacious. The previous HOA president, a man named Richard Chambers, had apparently created the fake easement document 2 years ago when he first hatched the plan to build storage units. He'd seen it as a revenue stream for the HOA, renting out units to residents and outsiders. He'd used old HOA letterhead, forged my grandfather's signature using a signature from a legitimate 2018 document, and created a fake notarization. Then, he'd presented it to the board as a legitimate historical document he'd found in the HOA files. Patricia Winters and the rest of the current board had taken him at his word, never thinking to verify something that looked so official. Richard had since moved to Florida, conveniently leaving before the construction began. When we reconvened in court 2 weeks later, Sandra had everything laid out in meticulous detail. She'd even hired a forensics expert who testified that the document was printed on paper manufactured in 2023 and used fonts that didn't exist in 1985. Douglas Hartman tried to argue that even if the 1985 easement was fake, the HOA had rights based on community need and years of treating the land as common area, but Judge Morrison shut him down quickly. Mr. Hartman, your argument has no basis in law. You can't claim adverse possession after 5 years, and there's no evidence the HOA ever used this land prior to this construction. The only thing your client is guilty of is relying on a forged document without due diligence. Mr. Baxter has clear title to this property. The easement the HOA is relying on never existed. She ruled completely in my favor. The construction had to stop permanently. The HOA had to remove everything they'd built, and they had to restore the land to its original condition as much as possible. She also ordered them to pay my attorney's fees and damages for the destroyed woodland. I felt triumphant, but also hollow. They couldn't bring back 200-year-old oak trees. They couldn't restore what had been lost. Patricia Winters approached me in the hallway afterward, her earlier haughtiness completely gone. Mr. Baxter, I am so sorry. I had no idea the document wasn't real. The board trusted Richard. We never imagined he would forge something like that. You should have verified it before you destroyed my property, I said coldly. You could have come to me, shown me the document, and I would have told you immediately that it didn't make sense. I know. You're right. We've already started proceedings to sue Richard for fraud, and I've resigned as HOA president. The whole board is stepping down. This should never have happened. I just nodded and walked away. Sandra caught up with me on the courthouse steps. Frank, there's one more thing you should know, she said. I did some more digging into Richard Chambers. He has a history of this kind of thing. He was forced out of another HOA in Georgia 5 years ago for financial irregularities. I've contacted the district attorney's office and given them everything we found. 2 months later, Richard Chambers was extradited back to North Carolina and charged with forgery, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Apparently, he'd planned to skim money from the storage unit revenue through a management company he secretly owned. The whole scheme might have worked if he'd been more careful with the details of his forged document. The HOA hired a restoration company to repair the damage to my woodland, though of course they couldn't replace the old growth trees that had been destroyed. They planted new trees, removed all the construction materials, and restored the topography as much as possible. It cost them over $200,000, which had to be raised through a special assessment on all the homeowners. I felt bad for the innocent neighbors who had to pay for Patricia's and Richard's mistakes, but Sandra reminded me that they'd elected these people, and it was their responsibility to oversee them. I used the damage award from the HOA to create a conservation easement on my entire 35 acres, working with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. This was a real easement, properly recorded, that would prevent any future development on my land forever. It would survive even after I sold the property or died. My grandfather's legacy would be protected. The new HOA board, led by a retired accountant named Helen Rodriguez, who actually seemed competent and reasonable, reached out to me with a formal apology and a request to start fresh. They wanted to establish a good relationship with all homeowners and ensure nothing like this ever happened again. "We've implemented new policies," Helen explained during a coffee meeting at my house. "Any significant expenditure over $10,000 requires independent legal review. Any documents claiming historical easements or rights have to be verified through the county records. And we've established a homeowner review committee that includes residents who aren't on the board to provide oversight." "That sounds like common sense," I said. "You'd think so, but a lot of HOAs operate like little fiefdoms. The president has too much power and everyone else just goes along. We're trying to change that culture." She paused. "I know we can't undo what happened to your woods, Frank. But I hope we can at least prove we're not all like Patricia and Richard." I appreciated her honesty and her willingness to take responsibility, even though she hadn't been part of the original problem. Over the following months, I watched as the new board actually improved the community. They fixed up the neglected pool, organized neighborhood events, and communicated transparently about all expenditures and decisions. The criminal case against Richard Chambers moved slowly through the system, as these things do. His lawyer tried to argue that it was a civil matter, not a criminal one, but the district attorney disagreed. Forgery was forgery, regardless of the motive. The case finally went to trial 8 months after the initial construction debacle. I had to testify, describing how I'd woken up to find my property being destroyed. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rebecca Cross, walked me through discovering the fraud and proving my clear title. She also called Sandra as an expert witness to explain the legal implications of the forged easement. The defense attorney tried to paint Richard as simply mistaken, claiming he'd believed the document was real. But the prosecution had found emails on Richard's old computer showing he'd researched how to forge historical documents and had specifically looked up my grandfather's signature. There were also communications with a printing company in Charlotte about creating vintage-looking paper. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict him on all counts. Judge Morrison, who had also presided over our civil case, sentenced him to 3 years in prison and ordered restitution of the full restoration costs plus my damages. Richard would be 70 years old when he got out, and he'd be paying off his debt for the rest of his life. I felt no satisfaction in seeing him sentenced. I just felt tired. The whole ordeal had consumed almost a year of my life. I'd spent countless hours dealing with lawyers, courts, and HOA meetings when I should have been working or enjoying my property. But something good did come from it. The story got picked up by local media, and then by a regional newspaper, and eventually by a couple of national websites that covered HOA horror stories. I started getting emails and calls from people all over the country who'd had similar problems with their HOAs. One man in Texas had his vegetable garden destroyed because it supposedly violated aesthetic standards. A woman in Florida had been fined thousands of dollars for having the wrong color mailbox, even though it was the color the developer had originally installed. A couple in Arizona nearly lost their home over HOA fees that had ballooned from a few $100s a year to several thousand due to mismanagement and corruption. The stories were endless and depressing. I realized I'd been lucky in some ways. Yes, I'd lost part of my woodland, but I had the resources to fight back. I owned my property outright with no mortgage, I had savings to hire a good lawyer, and I had clear documentation of my ownership. Many of these other people were trapped, unable to afford legal help, facing foreclosure over debts they'd never agreed to pay. I started connecting these people with Sandra and other property rights attorneys. I created a simple website documenting my case and providing resources for homeowners dealing with HOA overreach. It wasn't much, but it felt like something positive coming from a negative situation. Meanwhile, my woodland slowly healed. The restoration company had done good work, and nature is surprisingly resilient. By the following spring, the scarred ground was covered with new grass and wildflowers. The saplings they'd planted were taking root. It would take decades for them to become the towering trees that had been destroyed, but at least they had a chance. I spent more time back there than I had before, partially to monitor the restoration, but mostly because I'd realized how much I'd taken it for granted. I set up a trail camera and was delighted to see that the deer were coming back. Even the foxes returned, and one morning I spotted a great blue heron fishing in the creek that ran through the property. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after the initial construction incident, I was walking through the woods when I heard someone calling my name. I turned to see Helen Rodriguez, the new HOA president, walking carefully through the underbrush. "I hope I'm not trespassing," she said with a smile. "I called your house, but you didn't answer." "It's fine." "What's up?" "I wanted to let you know personally before we announce it at the next board meeting. We've terminated our contract with Douglas Hartman's law firm. They should have done better due diligence before allowing the construction to proceed. We've hired a new firm that specializes in property law and HOA governance. One of the first things they did was a complete audit of all our documents and claims." "Find any other surprises?" I asked. "Thankfully, no, but they did find a lot of sloppiness. Unsigned contracts, missing receipts, that kind of thing. Nothing criminal like Richard's fraud, but enough to make us realize we've been way too casual about proper documentation." She paused. "They also reviewed the bylaws and found that several provisions are probably unenforceable. We're going to propose amendments at the annual meeting to bring everything up to proper legal standards." "That sounds like good governance," I admitted. "We're trying." "Look, Frank, I know you probably hate the HOA now, and I don't blame you, but some of us are trying to make it work the way it should. Protecting property values, maintaining common areas, being good neighbors, not playing dictator." "I appreciate that, Helen. I really do." She looked around at the recovering woodland. "It's beautiful out here. I can see why you fought so hard for it." After she left, I sat on a fallen log and thought about the whole experience. The anger had faded, replaced by something more complicated. I understood why HOAs existed in theory. They could provide real benefits to communities. But they also concentrated power in the hands of a few people who often had too much time on their hands and not enough oversight. The problem wasn't the concept of shared community resources. The problem was the lack of accountability and the way some people used HOA positions to exercise petty authority over their neighbors. Patricia hadn't been evil, just careless and too certain of her own authority. Richard had been the actual criminal, seeing an opportunity to profit from a position of trust. I thought about my grandfather, who'd lived his whole adult life on this land. He'd have been horrified by what almost happened. But he also would have approved of how I'd handled it, standing my ground and fighting back with facts and the law rather than just accepting someone else's version of reality. The conservation easement I'd established meant that this land would remain wild forever, or at least as wild as any land could remain this close to a growing city like Asheville. Future owners couldn't subdivide it or build on it. The HOA could never again claim they had rights to it. It was protected by law and public record the right way. Sandra called that evening with one final update. "Frank, I just heard from the district attorney's office. Richard's wife filed for divorce and she's cooperating with investigators. Turns out he had similar schemes in the works in their community in Florida. He was apparently planning to create fake easements there too, claiming the HOA had rights to waterfront property owned by individual homeowners. Seriously, he was going to do this again. People like Richard never stop. They always think they're the smartest person in the room and they'll get away with it. The Florida authorities are very interested in talking to him now." "I hope they throw the book at him," I said. "They probably will. But Frank, the important thing is you stopped him here. If you just accepted that fake easement, he'd have gotten away with it and probably done it again somewhere else. By fighting back, you not only saved your property but probably saved other people too." After we hung up, I poured myself a bourbon and went out onto my back deck. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and pink. In the distance, I could hear the construction sounds from the development, someone building a new deck or addition. Normal neighborhood sounds. My phone buzzed with an email from someone in Nevada who'd read about my case online. They were fighting their HOA over solar panels and wanted advice. I'd respond tomorrow, I decided. Tonight, I just wanted to enjoy the peace. The next few months were blissfully quiet. The criminal case in Florida proceeded, with Richard eventually pleading guilty to additional charges there. My Woodland continued to recover. The HOA operated smoothly under Helen's leadership, handling routine maintenance and community issues without drama. I even attended a few HOA meetings, something I'd avoided in the past. Helen had instituted new rules about transparency and homeowner input. Meetings that used to be just the board announcing decisions now included actual discussion and debate. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. At one meeting, a homeowner proposed that the HOA should establish a community garden on a vacant lot near the entrance. It was the same kind of project that might have been railroaded through by Patricia's board, but Helen insisted on doing it right. They surveyed all the homeowners, held open forums to discuss concerns, consulted with a lawyer about liability issues, and eventually put it to a vote. The garden was approved and established properly, with clear rules and shared responsibilities. It actually brought the community together. I even volunteered occasionally, though gardening wasn't really my thing. It felt good to see the HOA functioning the way it should, as a tool for community benefit rather than a weapon for controlling neighbors. One warm evening in late May, about 18 months after the initial construction disaster, I was working in the garden when a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She was in her 30s, with kind eyes and dirty hands from working with the tomato plants. "Are you Franklin Baxter?" she asked. I nodded, suddenly wary. You develop an instinct about these things after fighting an HOA. I'm Emily Garrison. I just bought the house on Maple Court, the blue one with the white trim. I wanted to thank you. Thank me for what? For fighting back against the old board. When I was buying my house, the realtor told me about what happened. She said the HOA used to be terrible, but it got better after a homeowner stood up to them. She said you saved some woods from being destroyed and exposed corruption in the board. That's why I felt comfortable buying here. I was surprised and a little embarrassed. I just protected my property. Anyone would have done the same. No, they wouldn't have, Emily said seriously. Most people would have been intimidated by lawyers and official-looking documents. They would have assumed the HOA knew what it was doing. You didn't, and it made a difference. Helen told me the new board policies exist because of your case. You changed things. After she walked away, I thought about her words. I'd never considered myself an activist or a crusader. I'd just been a guy trying to protect what was his. But maybe that was enough. Maybe standing up for yourself when it mattered was how communities improved and bad actors got stopped. The second anniversary of the initial construction came and went without fanfare. The saplings in my woodland were growing well, already several feet tall. The native plants had re-established themselves. You could still see the scars if you knew where to look, but nature was slowly erasing the evidence of human interference. Richard Chambers served his time quietly, according to Sandra, who kept me updated. He'd be released in about 6 months and would face years of supervised probation. The restitution payments would follow him forever. Patricia Winters had moved away from Meadowbrook Heights, reportedly to a condo downtown where there was no HOA. I didn't blame her. Douglas Hartman's law firm lost several other HOA clients after my case became public. Turns out homeowners don't like lawyers who let their HOAs destroy property without proper verification. His firm eventually dissolved, and he joined a larger practice in Charlotte. I felt a little bad about that, though not much. He should have done better. The website I'd created about HOA rights and my case attracted steady traffic. I posted updates occasionally and shared resources. Several people contacted me to say they'd successfully fought their HOAs using information from the site. A law school professor even asked permission to use my case in a property law class. I said yes, hoping future lawyers would learn something about due diligence and clear title. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an experience. I went back to focusing on my software engineering job, dealing with the usual bugs and deadlines. I dated occasionally, went hiking in the mountains, and enjoyed my property. The HOA faded into the background of my life, a utility that maintained the shared areas without interfering with my daily existence. But I never forgot what happened, and I never took my property rights for granted again. I kept all my documents meticulously organized. I checked the county records periodically to make sure no one had filed any claims or liens against my property. I attended HOA meetings regularly, not to cause trouble but to stay informed and ensure the board remained accountable. Helen served out her term as president and then rotated off the board, replaced by another reasonable person who continued the reforms she'd implemented. The HOA established a reserve fund, maintained transparent financial records, and operated with the kind of professionalism you'd expect from any well-run organization. Imagine that. 3 years after the initial construction, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include my story in a film about HOA overreach in America. I was hesitant at first, but Sandra encouraged me to do it. "Your story has a good ending," she said. "You won. Most people don't. If you can show others that it's possible to fight back and win, that's valuable." So I agreed to be interviewed. The filmmaker, a young woman named Maria Chen, spent a day at my house filming me walking through the woods and talking about what happened. She was careful and respectful, not trying to sensationalize things but letting the facts speak for themselves. "The key to your story is the paper trail," Maria explained as we reviewed the footage. "You had documentation. The county records backed you up. The HOA's document was provably fake." That's not always the case. Sometimes HOAs operate in gray areas where the law is unclear or the documentation is ambiguous. Your case was cleaner, which is what made it winnable. The documentary came out about 6 months later and aired on PBS. My segment was about 15 minutes of a 2-hour film that covered HOA issues across the country. The response was overwhelming. My email inbox filled with messages from people who'd watched it, some sharing their own stories, others asking for advice. I couldn't respond to everyone, but I tried to answer as many as I could. I directed people to resources, suggested they contact property rights attorneys, and emphasized the importance of documentation and county records. Some people later told me my advice had helped them resolve their issues. The attention also brought some negatives. I got angry emails from HOA board members who felt the documentary unfairly portrayed HOAs as tyrannical organizations. Some accused me of exaggerating or lying about what happened. A few even suggested I'd somehow provoked the HOA into building on my land, though they couldn't explain how exactly I'd done that. I ignored the hate mail and focused on the positive. The truth was documented in court records that anyone could access. Judge Morrison's ruling was a matter of public record. The criminal conviction of Richard Chambers was real. No amount of angry emails could change those facts. 4 years after the initial construction, I got an unexpected call from Richard Chambers himself. He'd been released from prison and was living in a halfway house in Charlotte. His voice on the phone was smaller than I expected, worn down by time and consequences. "Mr. Baxter, this is Richard Chambers. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I wasn't thinking about the trees or your property or anything except money. I'm sorry." I didn't respond immediately, surprised by the call and unsure what to say. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Richard continued. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. I destroyed something beautiful for something stupid. I think about those trees sometimes, about what I took from you and the community. I'll be paying for it the rest of my life, and I deserve to." "Why did you do it?" I finally asked. "You weren't desperate. You had money, a home, a life. Greed, I guess, and ego. I thought I was smarter than everyone else. I thought I could create this money-making scheme and no one would ever figure it out. I convinced myself I wasn't really hurting anyone." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out I wasn't as smart as I thought." We talked for a few more minutes. I didn't forgive him, but I appreciated the apology. It took some courage to make that call, knowing I could have recorded it or used it against him somehow. When we hung up, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I was missing. The years continued to pass. The saplings in my woodland grew into young trees. The conservation easement remained in place, protecting the land. The HOA continued to operate properly under a succession of competent board members. Meadowbrook Heights became a genuinely nice place to live, the kind of community it should have been from the start. I kept my website running and occasionally posted updates. The documentary about HOA issues won some awards and aired periodically on PBS. My case became something of a textbook example of how to properly defend property rights against an overreaching HOA. Sandra Kim and I stayed in touch, meeting for lunch occasionally. She'd built a thriving practice partly on referrals from my case. She represented homeowners against HOAs across North Carolina and sometimes in other states. Her success rate was impressive because she'd learned from our case to always verify the documents, always check the county records, and never assume an official-looking paper was legitimate just because it looked official. "You started something," Sandra told me over lunch one day. "More homeowners are standing up to bad HOAs. More lawyers are taking these cases seriously. Things are changing, slowly but surely." I wasn't sure I'd started anything, but maybe I'd contributed. Maybe that was enough. 5 years after the initial construction, I decided to have a party in the Woodland to celebrate its recovery. I invited friends, some neighbors, Helen and the current HOA board members, Sandra, and even Emily Garrison from the garden who'd thanked me years earlier. It was a warm Saturday in June, perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. We set up tables and grills in a clearing, careful not to damage the young trees. I'd hired a local naturalist to give a short tour, showing everyone the different species of trees and plants, pointing out the wildlife signs, explaining the ecosystem. It was surprisingly interesting, even for people like me who'd lived here for years. Helen gave a short speech, thanking me for holding the previous board accountable and helping to create the reforms that made Meadowbrook Heights a better community. I was embarrassed, but touched. The current board president, a retired teacher named Michael Torres, presented me with a plaque recognizing my dedication to property rights and community integrity. It now hangs in my home office. As the sun set and people mingled, eating burgers and talking, I looked around at the recovering woodland and felt genuinely happy. The old trees were gone and could never be replaced, but new growth surrounded us. The land would be wild for generations to come. The community had learned hard lessons about accountability and doing things right. I'd learned lessons too. I'd learned that standing up for yourself matters, that documentation and facts are your best weapons, and that most people are reasonable if you give them the chance. I'd learned that bad actors like Richard exist, but they're usually undone by their own carelessness. I'd learned that institutions like HOAs aren't inherently good or bad. They're just tools that reflect the people who control them. Most importantly, I'd learned that my grandfather's legacy wasn't just the land itself, but the principle of defending what matters to you. He'd worked hard to buy this property and preserve it. I'd worked hard to protect it from people who thought they could take it just because they had an official title and a fake document. The party went late into the evening, with people sitting around a campfire telling stories and enjoying the peaceful sounds of the woods at night. Someone brought a guitar and we sang old folk songs, badly but enthusiastically. It was the kind of community moment that makes all the struggle worthwhile. As the last guests left and I cleaned up in the darkness, I heard an owl hooting in the distance. The woods were alive and healing. The community was functional and fair. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and life had moved on. I couldn't ask for more than that. The website I maintained continued to get traffic, and occasionally I'd update it with news about HOA reform efforts around the country. Some states were passing laws to increase transparency and accountability for HOAs. Others were making it easier for homeowners to challenge improper fees or rules. The documentary had contributed to a broader conversation about property rights and governance. But mostly, life just continued in its ordinary way. I worked, lived, and enjoyed my property. The HOA handled routine maintenance without drama. Neighbors came and went as people do. The woods grew stronger year by year. And every morning, I could look out my back window and see the woodland stretching into the distance, wild and free and protected, knowing that I'd stood up for it when it mattered most. That knowledge, more than any plaque or documentary or website traffic, made everything worthwhile. The HOA had tried to build storage units on my woodland. My lawyer had proved the easement was fake and I owned clear title. Justice had prevailed and the land was safe forever. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. Sometimes that's everything.